All right, we're going to start in just a couple moments because I try to be compulsive on this down. As I was saying in the back, and I don't want this to be considered sort of a vanity hearing for Schweikert. This is something I'm genuinely interested in. Whether you be the witness for the Democrats, the Republicans, my brothers and sisters on both sides here, I'm hoping we have a commonality of purpose, and that is, and we're going to say it hopefully multiple times, so if it gets communicated outside this room, that it's heard, stability and price efficiency. Now, what gets us there, you all as experts may have different opinions. This is sort of outside most members of Congress, almost every members of Congress's area of expertise, especially. At some point, I will also ask a question, just so you know it's coming. We break up jurisdiction between financial services and Treasury, where we're the original issuances, they're the secondary markets. Is this important enough that we should do this jointly or consolidate authority? So you may get some of those that are more internal mechanism sort of questions from us. All right? And with that, why don't we go ahead and pretend to get started here. If there's a little boy crying in the background, I have my 17-month-old here, and it's one of my great joys, but sometimes he thinks he's the one that should be on camera. All right, let's go ahead and start. Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. I'll let you, my good friend ranking member, grab his seat. All set? Good morning, and today's oversight hearing is focused on the Treasury markets. Our jurisdiction in the Ways and Means Committee is the initial issuances from Treasury. As many of us have focused on the rapidly rising cost, though some of our economists in our office basically say we're moving just back to normal. But either way, gross interest this year will be $1 trillion, making it the second highest cost in U.S. government, over Medicare and over defense. The other thing I'm also going to ask us to focus on is if we lay out history. Those of us remember, was it 2014, we had certain stresses, 2020, the repo market stresses, even the bond auction we touched on a little while ago, 6 weeks ago. Are these stressors to be concerned about, or should we be pleased that the markets actually work themselves out? We've had the issue where the Federal Reserve, during two of those, actually sort of stepped in and participated. Is that something also we should be paying attention to? As we move forward, the seriousness of this market, the seriousness of U.S. sovereigns in the world, the place it plays in the U.S. and the world economy, I think is not completely understood by members of Congress. That in many ways, this is the lubricant that makes much of the world economy work. I'm hoping through this subcommittee hearing, we start to educate staff, members ourselves, and the seriousness that this is not a game, that the communication, the seriousness, the adult-like understanding of that movements in this market can actually have cascade effects. And that's why we're hunting for stability. And with that, my ranking member, Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little history. You don't mind history, do you?
When it's accurate.
Oh, of course. President Clinton left office in 2001, running our last budget surplus. So far, so good.
Republican Congress.
Then came 2 decades of tax cuts for the wealthy, which blew holes in our budget big enough for Godzilla to waltz through. Without the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, revenues today would be on track to keep up with spending indefinitely, and the debt ratio would be declining. Even your charts would show that. You're saying that the debt ratio would not be declining if that was done?
And Mr. Ranking, if you told me this was your opening, I would have brought the charts that were shown.
Oh, okay. Bring them back the next time.
I will.
Let us be clear about the greatest danger to our nation's economic health, because that's where we're heading. Who are the threats coming? Where are the threats coming from to block America from paying its bills? Because we've got to pay our bills, and you would agree to that, I think. We have seen devastating consequences every time we've introduced default, threatened default. Sorry. Lowered credit ratings, skyrocketing borrowing costs, crippled job growth, and tumbling consumer confidence. Fitch downgraded America's credit rating to AA+ in August. Last month, Moody's moved America's ratings from stable to negative. Both changes are directly caused by default threats. Over and over, we've seen our economy held hostage over a budget shortfall the other side caused in the first place. During the last episode, the ransom demands included defunding the IRS to shield wealthy tax cheats. I thought we were over that. Obviously, we weren't, because we took that money, some of that money, and used it to pay to help our allies in Israel. This is funding Democrats' pass to close the tax gap and reduce the deficit. After we narrowly averted a catastrophic default, the House Republicans shamelessly returned to the single issue that unites your party, it seems to me: tax cuts for the wealthy. Fully extending tax scams would add another $3.5 trillion to the deficit. This is bigger than Mount Everest. Rather than continuing to push extreme proposals, we need to come together to start governing. It'll mean both sides, not just one. I know that. I know we stand ready, but I'm not holding my breath. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquale. I can't express my level of disappointment in your opening statement. We should have brought our charts that in the first 30 months there was $4.8 trillion voted out by the Democrat Congress, substantially, actually, what is that, 3 times the cost of the tax reform. But once again, the hearing was supposed to be focused on Treasury markets, liquidity, price stability, and where does it lead us? Grant, and is it Dreesen?
Yeah.
Dreesen is a specialist in public finance at the Congressional Research Service. Thank you for coming. Kent Smethers is a professor of business economics and public policy at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. Outstanding. Bobby Clogan is Senior Director, Federal Budget Policy at the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining us. Michael, and help me on the last name. Faulkner, okay, I should have got, is a Dean Professor of Finance at the University of Maryland, Robert H. Smith School of Business. Thank you for joining us today. And your written statements will be made part of the hearing record, and you each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Doctor.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Pasquale, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Grant Dreesen, and I'm a specialist in public finance at the Congressional Research Service. Thank you for inviting me to testify. Yeah, I never think yep. Every time I will make that mistake. Thank you for inviting me today to testify on behalf of CRS. As requested, I will provide background on federal debt management, briefly summarize current practices, and discuss developments and policy issues in light of recent budget and economic outcomes and projections. Congress holds the authority to issue debt on behalf of the United States through the power granted in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. While this power was delegated to the Treasury in 1789, Congress retains control over spending through the budget and appropriations process, revenue levels through tax legislation, and total borrowing through the statutory debt limit. If spending exceeds revenues, Treasury determines what type of debt instruments are used to finance the borrowing necessary to fulfill all obligations. Treasury aims to fulfill the government's borrowing needs at the lowest cost over time, while also acting predictably and maintaining sufficient liquidity for federal financial operations. Beyond financing the government, federal debt management also affects global markets due to the influential role of the United States in the world economy. Federal debt management has more influence on future budget and economic performance in the current high debt, high deficit environment. Persistently large deficits have led to significant increases in federal debt in recent decades, with heightened increases during the Great Recession and pandemic, but also with steady or increasing real debt in other more normal economic periods. Debt held by the public was $26.8 trillion at the end of November 2023, or about 98% of gross domestic product, GDP. As the stock of real debt and average federal interest rates rise, budget forecasts project that net interest payments will grow faster than both the general economy and other federal spending and revenues. CBO's long-term baseline projects that under current law and average economic conditions, net interest payments will grow from 2.5% of GDP in fiscal year 2023 to 6.7% of GDP in the fiscal year 2053. That 2053 figure is larger than projections of either total discretionary spending or Social Security spending. The federal government currently issues debt through several instruments, including Treasury bills, notes, and bonds, with maturities varying from several weeks to 30 years. These federal securities are issued through an auction process. Auctions and their offering amounts are scheduled and announced in advance of the auction date. The Federal Reserve, or Fed, works with Treasury's Office of Debt Management, acting as their fiscal agent. Because they are also backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, Treasury securities are often seen as one of the safest investments available, which significantly lowers federal net interest costs relative to other investment vehicles. Federal securities are owned by both individuals and institutions, domestic and foreign. In June of 2023, Federal Reserve banks were estimated to hold about 20% of federal debt held by the public. Other domestic entities were estimated to own another 50%, and the remaining 30% or so was attributed to foreign entities. Longer-term securities generally command higher interest rates compared to shorter-term securities because investors demand greater compensation for incurring risk over a longer period of time. Generally, a strong economy or high inflation will be accompanied by high interest rates, which may make the prioritization of short-term issuances more attractive. This, however, could lead to more volatile and uncertain yearly interest payments, as Treasury would have to enter the market more often, and involves a degree of uncertainty over future market behavior. During periods of economic downturn and low interest rates, Treasury may decide to prioritize instruments with longer maturities to take advantage of lower borrowing costs. Though such periods may also present an elevated need for predictable behavior and higher levels of liquidity to respond to economic turbulence. Interest rates can shift suddenly throughout the business cycle, underscoring the value of a flexible portfolio. Developments in recent years presented new challenges for federal debt management. Treasury responded to an uncharacteristically long period of low interest rates between the mid-2000s through the peak of the COVID pandemic by relying more heavily on debt instruments with a longer maturity period, locking in the low interest rates experienced at that time. Interest rates have subsequently increased in the past couple of years, and Treasury securities faced an inverted yield curve, with shorter-term debt instruments having higher rates of interest than longer-term ones for much of 2022 and 2023. These shifts further complicate the strategic choices for federal debt moving forward. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Good morning, Chairman Schweiker, Ranking Member Pascal, and other members of the... Okay. All right. I'm a professor at the Wharton School, faculty director of the Penn Wharton Budget Model and Research Associate at the NBER. After receiving my PhD in economics from Harvard in 1995, I worked at CBO for several years before heading to Wharton, and then later at Stanford. I also served a brief appointment under Treasury Secretary O'Neill during the early days of the Bush administration. My remarks today are my own. I previously submitted written remarks, had a few typos. I apologize about those, hopefully corrected. And there I discussed some more technical issues related to the Treasury auctions, international holdings and related items there. I'm happy to answer those types of questions a little bit later on. I want to use my brief remarks today to really talk three major points. The first one is without major changes in the U.S. fiscal policy, we estimate the Penn-Wharton budget model that the U.S. Treasury debt will be unable to roll over its accumulated debt in about 20 years. Put differently, the U.S. government will have to default either explicitly or implicitly through monetization, that is inflation of that debt. And that time span shortens if capital markets get spooked and believe that the U.S. policy will never create fiscal balance. Specifically, what we estimate is that the debt GDP ratio will hit about 190% by 2050, now likely even earlier. And unlike Japan, we just don't have the national savings to support that high level of debt. So if we ask the question, what size of policy change would it be required to create fiscal balance that is just enough money to be able to make spending promises as well as just interest payments, it would require either an immediate and permanent increase in all federal tax revenue of 40%, an immediate or permanent decrease in all spending by 30%, or some combination of the two. The second point is that even if Congress did stabilize the debt GDP ratio, but waited a couple decades to do it, it would have serious macroeconomic costs. GDP would be about 8% lower than it otherwise would have been. Wages would be about 4% lower, and borrowing rates would be about 150 basis points higher. And so far, that's actually the good news, because these calculations assume that capital markets are patient, that they believe something will happen. Congress will take big action within a couple decades. We certainly have a range of options that we can consider at this point, and we've posted some of those at the Penn-Wharton budget model, both on the more liberal and conservative side, a whole range. But the point is that simple options are not going to work. It's simply saying we're only going to limit tax increases on those making $400,000 and above. That's not going to come even close to covering the shortfall. Same thing with promises to cut spending, otherwise unspecified. That's not going to do anything either. The third issue is that I want to emphasize is that we can't really get distracted with side discussions here. Yes, one could always find some type of fiscal programs that pay for themselves, that they, even with higher deficits. But the truth be told, those are pretty uncommon. They don't scale very well. The more important issue here is that the blame game is just also irrelevant as well. We can argue until we're blue in the face, whether it's because of tax cuts, spending increases. I could make an argument for both, just simply based on the baseline. Both baselines are in terms of we really wouldn't let the AMT increase the amount of tax collection over time. Same thing with real bracket creep. That is often baked into people's baseline, and that's just not realistic. Congress would never have had that happen. Same thing with Social Security. Technically speaking, Social Security is not ever insolvent because cuts are going to happen automatically if Congress does nothing. But no one takes that seriously as a baseline either. And so baselines can certainly change people's views on things. But the more important thing is the blame game doesn't accomplish anything. It really doesn't tell us where to go from here forward. Even if I believed it was 100% due to tax cuts or 100% due to spending increases, the world today is completely different. It doesn't tell us the next best step. And so I think instead, it's we need to really focus on what is the next best step going forward, regardless of the blame game. And debt crises are the most serious of economic crises because they lower the government's ability to pay while also increasing costs. Thank you.
Chairman Schweikart, Ranking Member Pascrell, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. Today I intend to make 2 points. The first is that without the Bush tax cuts, their bipartisan extensions, and the Trump tax cuts, the ratio of debt to GDP would be declining indefinitely. The second is that our current rising debt ratio is due entirely to these tax cuts and not to spending increases. But when I say spending, I mean primary or non-interest spending, and every mention of revenues, spending, deficits, debt, mean those amounts as a percent of GDP. Okay, so recently Fitch downgraded the United States credit rating and Moody's put us on a negative watch. While each cited the long-term fiscal outlook in the last 3 years, each year the long-term outlook was better than the year before. Importantly, however, they each cited recent Republican-led debt limit brinksmanship. A default is the only true worry on our nation's ability to repay bondholders. This hearing is about debt service, and debt service is a product of debt and the interest rate, which is largely a function of primary deficits. So I'm going to tell you how we went from having primary surpluses to primary deficits. According to CBO, primary deficits are on track to shrink to roughly 3.3% of GDP over 30 years, high enough to cause the debt to rise indefinitely. The common refrain that you hear is that rising debt is due to rising spending. Revenues have been roughly flat for decades, and while spending was also roughly flat until recently, demographic changes and rising healthcare costs are now pushing it up. These facts are true. Our intuitions might reasonably tell us that if revenues are flat and spending is rising, then the one that is changing must be to blame. But I'm going to tell you why our intuitions are wrong. In CBO's long-term projections earlier this century, spending was projected to continue rising. But despite this, CBO routinely projected long-term debt stability, with revenues keeping up with rising spending. Not due to tax increases, but to our tax code bringing in more as Americans prospered. That prosperity results in both higher revenue collection and higher real after-tax income for the people whose incomes are growing. It is a win-win. In other words, we used to have a tax system that would fully keep pace with rising spending. And then the Bush tax cuts were enacted and expanded, and then on a bipartisan basis, eventually made largely permanent in 2013. Under CBO and OMB's baseline construction, temporary changes in tax law are assumed to end as scheduled. 2012 was therefore the last year in which CBO's projections reflected the Bush tax cuts expiring. Yes, these projections showed rising spending, but they also showed revenues exceeding spending indefinitely, with debt declining indefinitely. But ever since the Bush tax cuts were made permanent, CBO has showed revenues lower than spending and has projected debt to rise indefinitely. And since then, the Trump tax cuts have further reduced revenue. Without the Bush tax cuts, their bipartisan extensions, and the Trump tax cuts, debt would be declining indefinitely, regardless of your AMT assumptions. Now, 2 points explain this. The first employs a concept called the fiscal gap, which measures how much primary deficit reduction is required to stabilize the debt. The 30-year fiscal gap is currently 1.7% of GDP, which means that, on average, primary deficits over 30 years would need to be 1.7% of GDP lower to stabilize the debt. The size of the Bush tax cuts, their extensions, and the Trump tax cuts under current law is larger than that. And therefore, mathematically and unequivocally, without those tax cuts, debt would be declining, not rising. But the second is why spending is not to blame, even though it's rising. And I have behind me, I have a graph up that I'm going to make reference to. So as I said, CBO's 2012 long-term outlook was the last time that debt was projected to decline indefinitely. And relative to CBO's 2012 projection, current spending projections are down, not up. On the graph, the darker dashed line is lower than the lighter dashed line. In short, if you were trying to explain how we got from CBO's 2012 projection of declining debt to our current projections of rising debt, changes in spending have decreased the future path, not increased them. But changes in revenue have declined significantly more than spending. The darker solid line is far lower than the lighter solid line. Changes in revenue are therefore entirely responsible for going from declining debt to ever-growing debt. But importantly, a disproportionate share of the benefits of these tax cuts accrued to very rich Americans, highly profitable corporations, and wealthy heirs. Any discussion of how to address the deficits caused by these tax cuts should first look to the source. And, importantly, in any attempt to address the possibility that debt service could crowd out future investments, we must not cut our actual investments in the future. Thank you.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Pascrell, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the costs to the American people arising from increased federal debt service. I've been a finance professor for more than 20 years and had the privilege of serving as the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Department of Treasury from 2019 to 2021. In fiscal year 2018, outstanding public debt was just under $16 trillion. Cost of servicing that debt totaled $351 billion. By the end of fiscal 23, public debt had risen to more than $26 trillion. Debt service increased to $666 billion. So while the debt outstanding has risen 67%, The cost of servicing that debt has risen 90%, the result of the higher interest rates we're seeing recently. Even before COVID hit, our nation was on an unsustainable fiscal path. While the CARES Act was necessary to mitigate the economic harm from the pandemic, that spending was entirely debt financed. Spending has not returned to its pre-COVID levels. According to CBO, as was just said, government spending will continue to rise, consuming 23 to 25% of national output each of the next 10 years, compared to the last 50 years of just 21%. Revenue forecasts are at 18% of national output, which are above where revenues have been for the last 50 years at 17.4%. This permanent spending increase means debt as a percentage of GDP will rise unsustainably. Financial report of the U.S. government forecasts that if this current policy were extended over the next 75 years, it would result in a debt to GDP ratio of 566% compared to just 78% 5 years ago. Debt service costs are the result of both the amount of debt outstanding and the interest rate environment. One might think that minimizing interest costs is accomplished by simply issuing the maturity with the lowest yield. However, it depends upon the time horizon over which one is minimizing debt service costs. In 2020, interest rates on one-year bonds were less than 10 basis points, while coupon rates on the 10-year were at 0.625 and on the 30 were as low as 1.25%. If one were merely looking to minimize debt service costs in 2020, one might think Treasury should have only issued short-term debt. Instead, the Secretary increased the quantity of long-term debt in 2020 that was issued. While that marginally raised debt service costs, the American people today benefit from the fact that we issued, quote, higher cost debt, because today Treasury is still just paying 62 basis points on the 10 years that were issued at the time, rather than the 4 to 5% that they would be rolled over at today. Significant academic work on the term structure of interest rates of debt issuances of different maturities finds it to be upward sloping because, as was mentioned, investors bear greater risk on long-term bonds. One might therefore conclude that interest costs would be minimized by issuing just short-term debt. However, the bonds issued in 2020 demonstrate that there may be market conditions where Treasury will reduce long-term borrowing costs by issuing long-term bonds. As the chairman mentioned, recently long-term bond auctions have shown less demand than normal, particularly from international buyers. The central banks of both Japan and China have been reducing their ownership of U.S. Treasuries, likely reflecting that investors are growing more concerned about our nation's long-term fiscal stewardship. Whether we should pull back on issuing long-term Treasury bonds depends on whether government policy succeeds in reining in the recent 40-year high inflation. Reductions in budget deficits, deregulatory unleashing of the American economy would bring down inflation more effectively than the Federal Reserve merely raising interest rates. Issuing short-term debt that can be rolled over at lower bond yields would reduce long-term debt service costs. If instead we continue running unsustainable budget deficits and disincentivizing output, locking in today's interest rates might best mitigate the potential costs of having to roll over debt at even higher interest rates. I know that some have expressed concern that foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries are problematic for Americans. I would differentiate Chinese holdings in technology firms who provide inputs into sensitive national security tools or the purchases of farmland near military facilities as different than holdings in U.S. government debt. I believe we should welcome lower Treasury borrowing costs arising from foreign countries wanting to invest in our nation's future, provided that those investments don't sacrifice defensive capabilities. I believe we net benefit from being the world's reserve currency. In addition to lowering borrowing costs, it facilitates implementation of our national security strategy to monitor arms dealing, drug trafficking, and other illicit activities. Further, it facilitates using sanctions as an economic tool to punish bad actors, enhancing potential military and diplomatic activities. The impact on the American people of higher debt service costs extends beyond future tax rates. Rising interest costs will likely crowd out funding for other government services. Additionally, mortgage rates paid by American homebuyers directly result from the long-term borrowing rates for the U.S. government. I believe the best way for us to improve access to home ownership for young people is to get interest rates back down, which means the fiscal and regulatory policy need to assist the Federal Reserve in bringing down inflation. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. As a chairman's prerogative and an idiosyncrasy, I will go last on my questions. Think of it as batting cleanup. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chairman Schweikert, for holding this hearing. There is no question that the greatest economic and national security threat we face is our long-term debt and deficit. We can point fingers and argue all day long about whether it's a revenue or a spending issue, but one thing is clear, there's only one thing that will fix the problem, and that is a bipartisan, bicameral solution where everybody comes to the table. Our national debt has increased more than $6 trillion just in the past few years alone. The United States is currently, our debt stands at $33.8 trillion in debt. And as we know, the primary objectives of the Treasury's debt management strategy is to issue debt in a regular and predictable manner, to provide transparency in the decision-making process, and to seek continuous improvements to the auction process. So, Mr. Smethers, I'll start with you. Do you believe the Treasury's current debt management strategy is meeting these objectives?
The auction design is, I think, fairly efficient. It's a very large market. The secondary market is very liquid. If, from an economist perspective, if we're going to start all over again, I actually would have the U.S. Treasury mostly focus on long-term debt issuance, even if it means a higher interest rate that is paid. And the reason why we currently have the situation that we have is that we have debt markets who are making bets against what they think Treasury will issue in the future, Treasury making bets against the debt market, and that's not competition. That is just an incredible source of uncertainty. Instead, Treasury should focus on what it actually does. There's a big bias currently in the budget right now where it rewards Treasury for lowering the expected costs, freeing up money for other things. But it doesn't penalize for anything like rollover risk that comes associated with that shorter term cost. I would remove that budget bias. I have an idea in my written remarks to do that. But the real value that Treasury brings is the thing that private markets cannot bring, and that is the long-term risk-free asset.
Thank you. Mr. Falconer, as I understand it, the Treasury's debt servicing strategy not only impacts private investment, income growth, and things like mortgage rates, but also impacts the federal government's ability to spend on other policies and programs. Is this correct, number one? To put another way, how does the dramatic increase in debt servicing costs impact the federal government's ability to spend money on other policies and programs?
So yes, it's correct in that the Treasury rate serves as the base rate for most, if not all, global financial transactions. When we think about pricing out the interest rates we would see on whether it's mortgage securities, whether it's on car loans, but even international bond issuances, the Treasury rate serves as a base reference rate that's used. And so, while I wouldn't argue we should push towards entirely long-term, I think it's beneficial that Treasury issues the whole spectrum of interest rates to provide those base rates for a variety of transactions. And I think that their work with the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee to get guidance on where there are clientele effects or gaps in the maturity structure is beneficial.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kogut, we've had a front row seat in the last couple of years as America's credit has been endangered. We have only escaped fiscal calamity by the skin of our teeth. I'm listening to all of our great speakers here today. Over a decade ago, our committee heard testimony from the former IMF chief economist who said the impacts of default would be 10 times worse than the Great Recession. That's what he said 10 years ago. Can you detail what a default would mean for everyday Americans as quickly as possible?
Sure. So there are 2 points I want to make on that, Congressman. Appreciate the question. The first is on the credit side, and then the other is on the government side. So, right. As my fellow panelist was saying, the entire financial system is capitalized through the U.S. Treasury market, and so any single transaction that involves credit would be more expensive. The whole point is that if the government says it's going to pay you a certain amount in a certain time, you believe it. But if we're in default, that's no longer the case. And so home loans, auto loans, anything that involves credit is more expensive. But even if you are just buying from a business and you're not doing any credit, if the business is involved in the credit market and that's more expensive, then all the business costs are up. So any kind of purchase from an individual is more expensive. So that's on the credit side. And on the government side, the government's not allowed to issue new debt, which means it has to dramatically pull back its spending as we're no longer allowed to run deficits. And that means that any of the benefits that the American people rely on are no longer assured to come on time and in the full amount. Veterans benefits and disability compensation, child care, Medicaid payments to the states, you name it, those are all no longer guaranteed. So it would be cataclysmic for the country and for the world that also relies on our global financial market.
And I think you'd agree with me that when we look back historically, both parties are at fault in getting to the red line. Some more appreciably at different times, obviously. But in 2011 and 2013, in 2015 and 2023, this was driven by the Congress. The debt extortion, I use that word strongly, has led to devastating consequences. Our Treasury debt has long been the world's safest asset, historically. But default extortion has lowered credit ratings and created higher borrowing costs. You guys have referred to that. Can you explain how even threatening a default on our debt impacts our nation's economy and the ability of the federal government to maintain a stable market for Treasury securities? You understand my question? Am I clear? Am I clear?
Yes, Congressman. So absolutely, as we said, the entire financial market is capitalized by these treasuries. So if you're no longer certain, even if we don't default, if you now have in the back of your mind that we might default, then especially for the longer term bonds, you're going to want to price in some uncertainty, and that's going to raise rates. Now, it's not going to be cataclysmic in the way that the actual default would be, but that raises the borrowing cost in the margin of everything. So it is, if you want to talk about government waste, that is pure government waste. It is uncertainty out of nothing that raises borrowing costs both for the government and for everyday Americans.
Thank you. The deficit fell by a record $1.7 trillion during President Biden's first 2 years. The president has a plan to reduce deficits. Have you seen that plan? By nearly $3 trillion over the next decade. We've been focused on looking and protecting Social Security, Medicare. Members on both sides have different views of that. Can you explain why spending programs like Social Security and Medicare are not primarily responsible for our deficit? Why is it necessary to increase revenue and close the tax gap to reduce the deficit?
Thank you, Congressman. So taking the second part of your question first, the tax gap, for anyone listening who's unfamiliar, it's the difference between the amount that is legally owed under law and the amount that we take in. So the tax gap is the mixture of people cheating on their taxes and then accidentally paying the wrong amount. It's estimated to be over $600 billion a year. That's how much we don't take in that we're supposed to. That is bigger than the fiscal gap. So if tomorrow, obviously it's impossible to recoup all of it, and then you actually have to spend money to get it. But if tomorrow everyone started voluntarily paying the correct amount and not making mistakes, that would be enough to change our fiscal trajectory to having debt decline indefinitely. So it's an incredibly important source. The fiscal gap is 1.7% of GDP, and it's bigger than 1.7% of GDP. So therefore, it's just a mathematical truth that would be enough to have debt declining indefinitely. It's a great source of revenue to have people pay the taxes that they already owe. As to the first question for why it's spending why it's not spending, again.
No. Let you finish, and then
Sorry. As to the first part of your question, it's just, as I said in my testimony, these two tax cuts are bigger than the fiscal gap. So regardless of where you kind of want to place blame, like we mathematically know that they're enough to stabilize debt. And then the question about why we think that that's more fair than spending is just that spending is down and not up.
And for management of the room, we're just going to start doing 2-to-1 just because of the ratios. Mr. Scooby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was elected to Congress only 5 years ago, the debt was 21 trillion. Today, it's almost 33 trillion. So in 5 years, we put 13 trillion on the debt, and it's a staggering number that seems almost incomprehensible, especially to those in my district. When I try to explain that Washington has a spending problem and we're not addressing and balancing our budget. I come from the state of Florida, where we were required by Constitution to balance our budget every single year. And so the legislature is very good about making sure that we're operating like you would operate your family or operate your business, and not getting ourselves into the incomprehensible levels of debt that we've gotten our country into. Unless Congress gets serious about our spending problem, the consequences of Congress's failure to govern responsibly will have a disastrous impact on the lives of several generations of Americans. It is true that deficit spending is nothing new. With only a few exceptions over the past several decades, the federal government spends more money than it receives every year. Since we do not actually have the money to pay for our spending, the government borrows money by issuing debt in the form of Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. In just the past few years, the amount we are forced to borrow has grown dramatically. The national debt increased by almost 2.5 trillion just in this past year alone. Despite Congress's best efforts to bury its collective head in the sand, the bill will ultimately come due. The interest payments on our existing debt are growing at an unsustainable rate. In fiscal year 23, federal net interest payments skyrocketed up to $659 billion, a 40% increase from just the prior year. Debt servicing costs will soon be the second largest line item for federal spending, which will put it ahead of Medicare and defense spending. In recent months, both Fitch Ratings and Moody's downgraded their credit ratings on the government due to the large fiscal deficits and rising interest rates. We have been able to issue debt on favorable terms in the past because investors viewed them as a low-risk investment. Unfortunately, our bad decisions are catching up with us, and the market is starting to notice. We got away with spending like this for too long because interest rates were historically low. However, rates are on the rise, and our government does not appear to be ready for the consequences. Politicians from both sides of the aisle share blame for our addiction to spending money we do not have, and we are just now beginning to bear the consequences. Mr. Falkender, I'll start with you. Given the dramatic increase in debt servicing costs that we are experiencing, shouldn't this encourage Congress to tighten our belt instead of borrowing more money at a higher rate?
Certainly, yes, we definitely need to tighten our belts.
Your testimony points out that demand for Treasury securities at long-term bond auctions has declined. Why is that?
That's correct. So if we look at the last couple, there was a 10-year auction and a 7-year auction recently where there was less demand, particularly from international buyers. And so the prime dealers who participate, they had to soak up more of the issuances than they normally would have to.
Well, and you said too, what are the implications for that on the taxpayer?
So the implications are that yields therefore are going to be higher. The auction outcome at which the issuance actually goes through results in a higher yield, which means that interest payments are higher than what they were expected to be.
So in the last exchange with Mr. Pasquarello, Mr. Kogan was talking about if we were able to magically get $600 billion of people to pay what they're supposed to pay. Do you guys have any response to that, or do you have a difference of opinion on that issue?
Well, I think there's two parts, right? There's the tax gap, and then there's also, had we not engaged in some of the tax cuts. If that were the case, remember that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, for instance, made the tax code more progressive, not less. And so you're talking about a time of an affordability crisis for many American households, and the argument seems to be if only middle-class taxpayers were paying more taxes.
Mr. Smetters?
So even if we collected all the uncollected tax revenue, it's not going to come close to, it's still not going to balance the budget. It's simply the numbers aren't there, and that's a big hypothetical if we can even get a lot of that money. I mean, the bottom line here is, taxes have revenues come down, spending has gone up, and both sides are really to blame. And in particular, if you just look at spending for fiscal year 2023, it's about $600–700 billion more than you would have guessed just by trending the line pre-COVID. So both are happening.
You have anything to add to that in the remaining time?
Yeah, so, I think $600 billion would be helpful if we could kind of improve that on that side of the ledger. And I think while I think some of the numbers that we've been throwing out are quite pessimistic, one thing I would want to communicate is the sooner we act, even if it's only partially acting, the better, whether it's on the revenue side or on the spending side. I think, it would not get rid of the deficit entirely. Collecting $600 billion more in revenue every year would probably go some way to improving our debt trajectory, though how much is kind of is uncertain.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. Ms. Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your expertise. We greatly appreciate it. Just want to first say one of the reasons we're here today is Ways and Means has sole House jurisdiction over the federal debt, and to fulfill this committee's duty to ensure that existing federal debt is being managed at the lowest cost to the American taxpayer. Part of this means ensuring that the American people have more transparency surrounding the Treasury's debt management practices. So with that being said, Mr. Dreesen, it is my understanding that the Treasury has discretion over the debt management process. Is this correct? And if so, where does this discretion derive from?
Yeah, Treasury does have relatively broad discretion within to manage federal debt. So there's a lot of places in statute where that's provided. One of the big places is 31 USC in the 3100s. And so, Congress can certainly make changes to the what sort of powers they delegate to Treasury, but there is a lot of power with the Treasury Secretary and more generally.
So rulemaking also under the Code of Federal Regulations, I see, has happened over the years as well.
Yes, yes.
So do you know, since that time of that statute, like when is the most recent modification that this statute to the statute was made that is impacting the ability of the Treasury, either the better or worse, to manage our debt?
Sure. So I think the most observers would say kind of the last significant changes made to those portions of the code were several decades ago. I think there were large changes in the 1970s and 1980s, largely to make the process a little bit more predictable and transparent. There have been some small changes since then, 2010 and others, but I think significant, you're talking several decades.
Still significant ability to manage the debt.
Right.
Exactly. Thank you so much. As many know, the United States has benefited from historically favorable credit ratings, allowing the federal government to issue treasuries on relatively favorable terms. However, as funding deficits and projected debt to GDP ratios have grown over time, the country's credit rating has not. For example, on August 1st, 2023, Fitch Ratings downgraded the country's long-term foreign currency issuer default rating from AAA to AA+, which was the first time a ratings firm lowered its assessment of the U.S. government's ability to pay its debt on time since 2011. Mr. Falconer, can you please describe the relationship between Treasury's debt issuance strategy and credit ratings?
Sure. So all bond issuances have to be rated in order for many mutual funds and different fund families to hold them. And so there's the rating agencies differently model out governments, corporates, utilities, and financials, and then they set a rating on the likelihood of being repaid. Treasury meets with the three major rating agencies each year to discuss the fiscal outlook and to give, and from that information they obtain, the rating agencies then provide a rating that is, as been said by my panelists, the foundational interest rates that are provided in global financial markets.
Well, let's bring this home. How does this affect American families? The bottom line there.
So the higher the borrowing costs for the U.S. government, the higher the borrowing costs for nearly every other form of credit for the American people. So it's not just that they are going to pay higher taxes in the future to support higher interest costs, but any borrowing they're doing in their own household is going to be higher if U.S. Treasury rates are higher because their bond rating is lower.
Thank you. So quickly, since I'll stick with you, Mr. Falconer. You may recall a slide that Mr. Kogan shared earlier today during his testimony, which argued that revenue and spending are both lower than earlier projections, suggesting that low revenues are responsible for the persistent primary deficits. So what are your thoughts on this, and do you agree with Mr. Kogan's proposal?
Well, again, the revenue forecasts relied upon current law extending in ways that it's not clear Congress actually would have. So we suffered, for instance, from what's known as bracket creep, which is that as people made more money, a higher portion of their income was then thrown into a higher tax bracket. In order to have those CBO projections continue, you would have had to assume that Congress would not have fixed that. Likewise, as we know, the alternative minimum tax, for instance, was implemented to capture a couple of millionaires that weren't paying very much in federal income taxes. And yet by into the 2000s, you had, a few million taxpayers being hit by the AMT. And so Congress came in and modified it because it extended beyond what its original objective was. One has to presume that Congress would not have made those fixes that American households would be paying about 25% higher taxes today.
Well, let me ask you this. Aren't a lot of these things static numbers? Isn't there a lot of growth that happened because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
So that is the other piece, is that you have to presume that we would have continued to have the growth output we had. We saw higher growth rates following the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There's some recent academic work that shows that. It's hard to argue that we would have had the same economic output and the same spending levels had tax rates been
So
substantially.
historically, where are we with revenues today?
Revenues is a percent of GDP, which is, I think, the best way to look at it. In 2022, for instance, we're the fourth highest on record.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Chu.
Mr. Kogan, I want to address an accusation leveled against Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, alleging that she committed the biggest blunder in the department's history by not refinancing the public debt when interest rates were historically low. This accusation assumes that the Treasury could have easily auctioned trillions of dollars in long-term securities at a very low interest rate on the bond market. Of course, the Secretary cannot compel investors to purchase the securities at Treasury auctions. And in fact, former Treasury Secretary Mnuchin explored the idea of refinancing the debt this way under the Trump administration and found that there was no viable market for these bonds. So we already know that there is no quick fix to reduce debt servicing costs. The reality remains that Republicans' commitment to cutting taxes for the wealthy and corporations is the reason for the country's rising debt ratio. So, Mr. Kogan, can you talk more about the issues with this proposed simple fix for reducing debt servicing? Why did Secretary Mnuchin find that this option was not viable when he studied it in 2019?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Yeah, precisely as you said, you cannot induce demand. You cannot force people to buy stuff. But even if you, it's even deeper than that, because even if you could compel people to buy at the rate you want, the Treasury deliberately tries to diversify, how it's doing the bond market. It deliberately wants to make sure that there's not too much demand for certain kind of treasuries, too little demand. It has a vested interest in making sure that the entire market is stable, and that is far more important than kind of winning a little bit in the margin. Maybe you could do a little bit in the margin, but the stability is the most important thing. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't point out, even if you then did do this and you were able to lock in really low rates for a lot of the debt, that has very little to do with kind of the long-term trajectory. Eventually that debt rolls over and then you're right back where you started. Yes, you kind of gained a little bit by getting to benefit from lower stuff, but the long-term issue is driven by the fact that revenues are lower than primary spending, not that we locked in interest a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And that is kind of the big issue. And as I said, that is caused by these tax cuts.
Mr. Kogan, unfortunately, there are far too many tax loopholes that benefit the wealthy in our tax code, and I am working with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, chair of the Senate Budget Committee, on legislation to close one of those harmful loopholes in the tax code. Normally, the wealthy are subject to capital gains taxes when they sell appreciated assets like stock. But if those assets are instead donated to a 501c4, the donor pays no capital gains taxes at all, even if the organization sells the assets immediately after receiving the donation. This loophole effectively gives a public subsidy to the wealthy for engaging in political activity like lobbying and seriously reduces tax revenue. For example, earlier this year, billionaire Barry Seed donated $1.6 billion in stock to a right-wing nonprofit organization that engages in political activity, avoiding a tax bill of up to $400 million. So, Mr. Kogan, can you talk about the impact of closing tax loopholes like this one? Can Congress improve our fiscal condition by ensuring that the wealthy pay their fair share?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yeah, it's making sure that the kind of these forms of capital are not getting preferential treatment is an important way of both of kind of increasing equity in society and also in terms of helping the federal government. I think the estimate is that more than half of capital gains have never been taxed and will never be taxed. You get the full build-up, and then in the example you give, they get to pass it over, and then the basis is reset. And so then if they sell it immediately, there's no gains, right? It's another way in which, in the case of Mr. Seed, most of the gains from his business will never be taxed, and that's a major problem that has huge effects on our federal outlook. The one thing I'll say is, so the president proposed a plan, tax plan that would be only above only bringing in revenue above folks making $400K in profitable businesses. That itself is, his proposal is almost enough by itself just to stabilize our long-term outlook. It's slightly below the fiscal gap. If you did a little bit more, that would be enough. This is a major, major, major source of revenue.
And in fact, earlier, somebody on the other side of the aisle said that despite our $688 billion in the tax gap, that how could we magically pay for this? But is there a way to pay for it? And let's talk about IRS funding.
Sure. So the tax gap, as I say, it's bigger than the fiscal gap. So you cannot get it all. You have to spend money to get it. That ends up, netting down the cost. And regardless, you won't be able to get it all. But it's a major source of lost revenue of people simply cheating on their taxes or kind of mispaying. As I said, if we could get it all, we can't. But if we could get it all, that would be enough not to balance the budget, but to stabilize our debt ratio.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Ms. Fishbach.
Sorry, had to find my button. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Falkender, is it? I can't actually, the chair's too big. I'll lean in. Okay, I'll lean in. And thank you very much. But I know that Congresswoman Tenney kind of was led up to some of this, but maybe you could describe the impact of the higher Treasury yields have on the American family in layman's terms. So what is it really doing to the American family budget?
Sure. So let's think about the mortgage rate that the American household pays on their 30-year mortgage is going to be priced off of the 10-year Treasury bond. So think about where 10-year Treasury bond yields were back in the 2020, 2021 timeframe. They were around 1%. And so therefore you were able to get households to get 30-year mortgages at around 3%. There's going to be a gap because, as of course, the federal government is going to be a higher quality credit than an individual household, and so there's a spread that households pay. Today, the 10-year bond is closer to 4.5%, and so you've got mortgage rates closer to 7%. Again, as the 10-year Treasury yield went up, so did the borrowing rate for households. Now, this has enormous problems because, for instance, a $250,000 mortgage on a house back in early 2021 would have about $1,000 a month in a principal and interest payment. At today's interest rates, that would be closer to $1,700 per month. That doesn't just make homeownership less affordable for people newly looking to purchase a home, but it also means that people are somewhat trapped in their existing homes. So imagine for a moment that you got married and your spouse and you bought a house, but you were looking to maybe move to a different school district or get a larger home when the kids were of school age. Right now, if you move, you don't get to take your mortgage rate with you. And so that means that if you move, you lose the 3% mortgage rate that you had when you refinanced back in 2020. And now you're possibly going into a 7.5. And that makes it nearly unaffordable for many, not just to start homeownership, but then continue on the path that we normally think about families engaging in.
Thank you very much. And, can you maybe talk about some of that in comparison to what's going to happen with the economic growth?
Sure. So, okay.
See, you get up close and it's scary.
I barely moved.
What's going on with me?
So the other thing, though, it does is there's something called labor mobility, which also, because we've locked people into their houses, it makes it more difficult for people then to move. So let's say that a new work opportunity arose in another town. Again, it's now significantly more expensive for somebody to move and take that alternative job because, again, you don't get to take your mortgage rate with you. Also, purchases of automobiles, any kind of purchase that consumers are making on credit is now that much larger. If small business loans are now higher interest rates. So that's going to curtail the type of investment we see. And that's why we've seen, for instance, that the number of pending home sales is at 20-year lows. So there's reductions in a variety of economic of industries as a result of these higher interest rate environment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it really is important, I think, that the American people understand, how this really is affecting and their inability to purchase a home, to purchase the cars, and I appreciate the fact that you mentioned the labor mobility issue too, because there's lots of other job offers going around and makes it difficult. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate it, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much. There we go. The reality is Biden inflation is driving our national debt to unprecedented levels, not only burdening future generations, but also actively punishing working families and forcing people across the country to choose between putting food on the table and paying for things like rent. The American people are suffering and tightening their budget right now. The federal government should be doing the same thing. The last few years of spending levels weren't just unsustainable. They were reckless and unfair to future generations who will be forced to foot the bill. To borrow from my friend, the Budget Committee Chairman, we didn't get into this massive amount of debt overnight, and we won't get out of it overnight. But we cannot get ourselves out of this mess just by cutting spending. But through sound tax policy, we can and need to grow our way out of this. I'm looking forward to the Tax Subcommittee hearing later today, which we will look at the successes of TCIA, which brought in record revenues and created unprecedented growth. And this is our Tax Cut and Jobs Act, as all of you are familiar. I've got a question for Mr. Smetters. Since 2021, we have seen the federal debt balloon by more than $6 trillion, all the way up to an unprecedented $33.8 trillion. This debt not only strains the federal government's ability to service the debt, but also costs Americans, families, and taxpayers tremendously through increased mortgage rates, car loan rates, and every other day necessities. Mr. Smetters, what can Congress do to help mitigate the cost of servicing this extremely high debt for American taxpayers?
The main thing it can do is simply reduce the deficits over time, and that's either through more revenue with less spending or a combination of both, and that would lower interest payments that are required to be paid on that debt. And there's a lot of focus on these ratings, but keep in mind ratings really focus on technical default of the failure of the government to pay. Markets are much more concerned about potential for monetization of future debt and through higher inflation, and that is not going to be captured in ratings at all. So there's much more scare out there than is captured by ratings alone. I appreciate that.
Mr. Faulconer, in fiscal year 2023 alone, debt increase soared to $659 billion, a nearly 40% increase from fiscal year 2022. And on top of that, within a few years, debt service costs alone are expected to become the second largest federal government outlay, only behind Social Security. So is there anything the Treasury can or should be implementing in this debt servicing and management strategy to help mitigate costs for the American people?
I think the most important thing Treasury can do is, as Kent just mentioned, is work to reduce the budget deficit. So, for instance, we saw Treasury issue rules regarding the electric vehicle tax credits that were much more generous than they needed to have been. We have seen, for instance, just earlier this week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about Treasury opening up COVID money for states that instead could be reprogrammed towards other activities. Anything we can do to bring down the budget deficit would lower our future debt service costs.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Kogan, in your testimony, you said that our current rising debt ratio is due entirely to both Bush and Trump tax cuts, not spending increases. Can you honestly sit here and justify the current spending levels that we have seen over the last few years?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Yes, I can. I think the important thing for us to figure out as a society is what we want our government to look like, and then we should figure out how to make sure we
know what our government looks like. I'm asking you not what the government looks like. I'm asking you, can you sit here and look me in the eye and justify the spending levels that we have seen since the Biden administration took over when you are complaining that it's all the Bush and Trump tax cuts that caused it, even though we have seen record amounts of increased revenue as a direct result of things like the TCJA?
Thank you for the question. So I'd make 3 points on this. The first is that we had the strongest recovery in the world among G7 countries. That is a really, really important thing. I'm glad that we are serious about the COVID
glad that we are
response.
at $33.8 trillion debt.
I'm glad that we
good
did not
thing.
have an economic calamity. I'm glad that we responded correctly.
But do you not
and-
think that it's going to short term and that we will potentially have that when you're looking at $33.8 trillion in debt?
The stock of debt is different from the long-term trajectory. So what the recession spending did was we pushed up the stock of debt, but that has little effect on the long-term trajectory of our debt ratio.
We are going to be
starting
at a
from higher
point
level.
where the second largest federal government outline is going to be servicing that debt. That's long term.
Right, but the long-term debt ratio is driven by the flows in the
Thank you.
future
Thank you,
rather
I yield
than.
back.
Thank you, Ms. Van Dyne. I want to get to Mr. Schneider because he has another place he belongs right now.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the witnesses. A lot of good things here. Let me start with just a question for Mr. Kogan. In opening remarks, it was noted that we had a balanced budget in 1999 with a Democratic president, Republican House. What was any of you know the spending or the revenue? I'm sorry, the revenue side as a percent of GDP in 1999?
I don't have 99, but the height that we got was 20% of GDP.
Right, it was actually 19.6,
Right.
To be precise. And by the way, I will agree with my Republican colleagues. We all rightly should be concerned about our level of debt. I think we are talking about it. 33 trillion is a massive number, and as you said, Mr. Kogan, it's not sustainable if we stay on the current trajectory. We have to take specific action. Dr. Smetters, you made a comment just a moment ago. It's not just the drop of our ratings with the credit agencies, it's if there's a loss of confidence. One of the things I believe the credit agencies noted in the ratings cut is the failure of Congress to take the necessary steps to show that we're serious about that. Do you think that was a fair assessment of Fitch and others?
Sure, but do keep in mind Fitch is really focused on the narrow question of whether payments will be made.
Right. But S&P took that position when they did it a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Do you think others are looking at us and saying if Congress can't act, there's reasons to be concerned about United States' future fiscal trajectory?
Absolutely. Once capital markets believe that fiscal balance will not happen, you'll see a big unraveling.
And Mr. Kogan, maybe you know this, but our discretionary spending, is it significantly higher than it was in 1999 when the two lines crossed at 19.6, 20%?
No, our recent kind of post-Budget Control Act levels are significantly below average in the post-1986 kind of world. And in fact, non-defense discretionary minus the VA shrank this year, and it from the previous year, which itself shrank from the previous year. We kind of have a semi-stable, somewhat shrinking trend for NDD.
So if I follow your logic, going back to when we had things in balance at roughly, let's call it 20% for sake of argument, revenues and spending both in at 20% of GDP. Our revenues today are what percent?
We're down to 16.5, not among the highest ever, but instead the lowest ever in good economic
Wait, I
times.
thought I heard we were at record. 16.5, less than 20%?
Significantly less, Congressman.
Okay. So let me stick on this for a moment, because if the revenues are lower, there's a number of reasons that might be. One is, as you've noted, the tax cuts in previous administrations. The other one also noted is this tax gap. And that's something I've been very much focused on. You said we can't get all of it. I think one of the reasons you expressed that was because that there's going to have to spend money to get it. Compliance is a key piece of this. What would happen if we cut the investment that the administration has asked for and Congress approved in increasing our compliance? What's likely to happen to the tax gap?
Well, absolutely will increase. It'll send a signal to would-be tax cheats that not only is the United States not serious about going after tax cheats, but that even if we, in the one time where we looked like we were going to get serious, that there was massive mobility against doing it. So I believe it would increase lack of compliance.
Okay, so if there's a greater tax gap and there's a greater need to try to get to a place where we're bending the curve and reducing our deficits, who's the burden going to fall upon?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
I guess it's a leading question. I'll ask it even more leading. If we signal to the tax cheats that it's open season, if we let the tax gap expand because the IRS doesn't have the ability to enforce the laws on the books, doesn't that put a greater burden on law-abiding taxpayers?
That's right. Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, it is a deeply unfair thing for the supermajority of us who pay our taxes, Democrats, Republicans, independents, non-voters, most of us pay our taxes, to give special preference to tax cheats is bad for fairness, and it's bad for America, and it's bad for our federal coffers.
Maybe not just calling them tax cheats, but freeloaders and free riders, people who are taking advantage of those who obey the law, because there are too many people in this body, in Congress, who are trying to eliminate the ability to go after those tax cheats and make sure that we're doing what we can to serve those who are honoring the law. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider, and I appreciate your patience. I know you needed to run on us. Mr. Finstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank each of our witnesses for your testimonies today. I think each of you made it very clear that we are in some very serious times with our debt, and it's on the backs of our children and grandchildren. And if we don't act, there's going to be severe ramifications. We've also just heard about the 10-year yield, how that affects families and businesses when it comes to loans on houses, cars, operational loans for businesses. This is real. But I want to talk about more macroeconomics and the risks that are out there. And one thing that is not talked about is when you start having all this spending, when you're having all these treasuries being sold, you're flooding the market with treasuries. In effect, it affects private investment, literally affects private investment, and that's what I want to talk about. Dr. Falconer, or Mr. Falconer, can you expand on this, that how would the private enterprise and the private sector, private investment be affected by all this flooding of paper on the market?
Sure. So the reason that firms are going to engage in the private investment is because spending money today is going to generate better outcomes in the future. But because it's now going to be more expensive to move that money from the future back to today in terms of the higher interest rate environment, that's going to make incremental investments less valuable. They're not going to look as strong. And so you're going to see companies less competitive, less beneficial to engage in that investment. And that means companies are going to pull back on the kind of infrastructure investment and facilities and equipment investments in intellectual property. Ultimately, real wage growth comes from matching capital with labor. And if we reduce the incentives of businesses to allocate capital to match with that labor, you're reducing real wage growth, and that reduces income for future Americans.
Exactly right. And that's my greatest fear. I mean, we can talk about the interest rates and all this stuff, but there's this big macro effect that's going to affect so many other things, especially when it comes to GDP, and I want to talk to Mr. Smetters about that. Staying on the topic of macroeconomics, you stated in your testimony that if federal debt is allowed to increase to 180% of GDP over the next 30 years, the economic consequences would be severe. GDP would fall to around 8%, wages would fall by 4%, interest rates would go up by 1.5%. I want you to discuss this scenario further, and what time frame do you see? I mean, this is big stuff. This is really serious stuff. I want your thoughts, Doc.
Yeah, in fact, this is the good news, because that's the most optimistic that we could actually project our framework. And in particular, because of this crowding out effect that was just described of a reduction in investment, it's going to shrink the capital that's available in the economy. It's going to reduce GDP relative to where it otherwise would have been at about 8%. Literally, we cannot solve the model after that point. There's just not enough national savings. A lot of times people make a comparison against Japan. It's just not right for many reasons. And so this is the most optimistic that we can even get with the model. If capital markets really believe that Congress is not going to take action, everything unravels even faster.
Yep. So, Dr. Falconer, I want to go back to you then. So, on that same front, right, if you look at the global world and where we stand with the European Union and all this stuff, if we continue to slide down this path of lowering our GDP and continue with flooding the market with flooding the bond market with paper, what does this do to the rest of the world? What does this do to our dollar?
So traditionally, the strength of our economy, the strength of our ability to engage in foreign policy, engage in our national security is a result of the strength of our underlying economy. So if we reduce our growth rate, that reduces our ability to, for instance, maintain our status as the world's reserve currency.
Right.
Well, the world's reserve currency, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, facilitates our ability to engage in sanctions on the national security. It allows us to monitor illicit financing, drug dealing, arms dealing around the world. All of those activities are endangered if we don't get our fiscal house in order and if we continue down this path that would jeopardize our status as the world's reserve currency.
Yeah. I want to thank you for those comments. I mean, this is catastrophic, not only to our nation, but around the world and what it does to our U.S. dollar. And that's why we've got to get our arms around this. And I thank the chairman for putting this together, as it is so critical. So I look forward to figuring out a fix. I hope you guys are all involved in trying to understand what a fix looks like. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Malley-Takis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The national debt has skyrocketed by more than $6 trillion over the last 2 years and is now nearing $34 trillion, and that represents over $100,000 in debt for every American man, woman, and child. The current fiscal trajectory is unsustainable, and American families are already feeling the financial hit through higher interest rates on mortgages, cars, and other goods and services financed in the economy. Servicing this debt has crowded out other government spending and forced the government to prioritize interest payments at the expense of American families. As early as next year, paying off the interest on the debt alone could become the second largest federal outlay after Social Security, more than Medicare and defense outlays at a time when Medicare Part A is predicted to be insolvent by 2031. There has been a lot of discussion today about what happens if we continue on this current trajectory. But I want to shift to the circumstances around who holds our debt, specifically foreign and international holdings, which now accounts for $7.3 trillion. And this includes foreign adversaries like Communist China, which holds roughly $800 billion in America's debt. I'll turn to you, Mr. Smetters, first. Many believe that the risk could be mitigated by addressing foreign countries' role in bidding for and ultimately owning our national debt. Can you please speak more about the role that foreign adversaries and other nations play in our debt servicing process, and what is it beneficial, and what are the challenges?
Sure. So as testimony given earlier pointed out, there's a really big difference between China buying our debt versus them investing in our critical infrastructure and things like that. Right now, if anything, they're giving us a subsidy so we can build up our critical infrastructure. The international component of that is, if anything, right now, a good thing for us, and it's not really a major risk.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on that point? No. You guys all look tired.
I would just say I agree.
Okay, you agree. Great. I'd like to I would like you guys to expand a little more. I mean, you brought up some really important points as it relates to keeping America's dollar as the reserve currency. And I want to just give an opportunity for you to expand on some of the other benefits that it is for the American taxpayer. Anybody?
I mean, I think it actively lowers our net interest costs. I think estimates range on exactly how much that's worth, but I've seen things around 25 basis points in terms of the interest rates that Treasury is facing, and that's quite large when you kind of map that out in terms of federal cost per year if we were to cede the reserve currency to someone else.
I would just add that being the world's reserve currency facilitates our sanctions activity. It facilitates capital flows, not just to the federal government, but to American businesses and company, as well as households. And then it also enables us to monitor illicit transactions. So everything from sex trafficking to arms dealing to drug trafficking. The fact that dollar-denominated securities pervade the global financial system means that financial institutions around the world willingly participate in our oversight of these transactions, and that's enabled by the fact that we have the world's reserve currency.
And how threatened do you think this is right now, the debt, U.S. debt, and the impact it could have on us being the reserve currency?
I had the privilege of testifying to the Financial Services Committee about this a couple of months ago, and I think our view is there's kind of three factors at play. You want to maintain a regulatory environment such that we have the most liquid, transparent markets in the world. Second, you want to be a strong financial steward such that reserve banks want to hold your assets denominated in your currency. And then third, you want to make sure that you don't abuse your position as the reserve currency when it comes to engaging in unilateral sanctions or unilateral punishments that abuse that position. And so maintaining those three things, I think, are essential to maintain status as reserve currency.
30 seconds left if anyone else wants to add.
The biggest threat for the U.S. economy is still the longer term. So certainly we could maintain a reserve currency, but if financial markets get nervous about our willingness to monetize that debt, which is the last channel, that's what has to happen mathematically if we don't close this imbalance, then that's when the financial markets are going to demand a much higher return, and this whole thing could literally unravel.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your commitment in getting our fiscal house in order.
Thank you, Ms. Maloukakis. Ms. Delbeni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Kogan, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to an earlier question about the impact the Bush and Trump tax cuts had on the federal debt, and I'd love to hear your view on what that is, and well, let's start there.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So I think the right way to look at kind of the long term is this concept called the fiscal gap. It measures how much primary or non-interest deficit reduction you need to go from having debt be on its upward trajectory as a percent of GDP to being stable as a percent of GDP. Not balanced budgets, not flat debt, but debt as a percent of GDP stable. And the most recent estimate using CBO numbers is 1.7% of GDP. The size of the Bush and Trump tax cuts under current law is bigger than that. So that means even if you want to say, well, you could blame other things as well, regardless of where you want to place the blame, that just means that they're big enough that if you hadn't done them or if you undid them today, that debt would be stable as a percent of GDP. And that's kind of the starting point. I then think that it's right to focus on them because our spending trajectories, our long-term spending trajectories are down, not up. So we used to have a system where revenues and spending would keep pace regardless of your assumptions about AMT. Now we don't. Since then, both revenue and spending are down. So it doesn't make sense to me to blame spending if our long-term trajectories are actually down instead of up.
And sometimes the investments we make a big difference on the long term. Child poverty costs our country $1 trillion a year in lost productivity, crime, health disparities. And so how can programs like the Enhanced Child Tax Credit that increase children's opportunities for success and help rebuild the middle class, how can those benefit long-term economic growth?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So I think there's broad agreement that investing in children is a very wise thing to do. You see higher birth rates, you see higher graduation rates, you see higher wages, you see therefore more money into the federal government, you see lower crime rates, you see lower recidivism rates, and then at the same time you see the moral benefit of millions of children lifted out of poverty. There's strong agreement. In fact, CBO just released a working paper a couple weeks ago that showed that their estimate was that even if you didn't offset it, enrolling children in Medicaid on a net present value basis paid for half of itself. And that if you did then offset it, then it was a 2-to-1 return. So there's strong agreement that investing in children is a very wise thing to do, even aside from the moral imperative.
And that not investing has a cost. As I said earlier, child poverty costs us $1 trillion a year. Sometimes if we don't invest, it actually costs us more money over the long run, which I think has been left out of this conversation a little bit. In your testimony, you discuss how earlier in the 21st century, CBO forecasted long-term debt stability despite its initial outlook projecting primary spending to rise as a percentage of GDP. I wondered if you can speak to the role our tax system played in CBO's calculation of long-term debt stability and what's changed since then.
Thank you, Congresswoman. In the CBO baseline, they assumed bracket creep. I think some of my fellow panelists are against that concept. I don't think it's a bad thing that needs to fix. If I get a raise that outpaces inflation, then more of my income is taxed at a higher rate. That is the natural part of a progressive tax system. That is not a bad thing. And so regardless of whether you then went in and changed your AMT assumptions, we used to have a tax system where our revenue was going to grow to match our spending. And that's kind of the most important part. Since then, we've done these tax cuts. They not only lowered the level, they not only did a level increase, but they also flattened the tax code. The jump from one tax bracket to the next tax bracket is smaller than it used to be, and kind of the income bands in some places have changed. That leads to less bracket creep than there used to be, and therefore less kind of natural income gains from the real wage gains that when Americans get them. So those two components led to our revenue no longer keeping pace with our spending, and in fact no longer growing quite as much when we have a good economy. We used to see when the economy was great, revenues shot way up. Now they shoot up some. The fact that we have this economy and had revenues down at 16.5% of GDP, that shouldn't happen.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Delbenny. Ms. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of the witnesses for appearing. This is certainly a master class. And one of the great privileges of being a member is to have such expertise here. I just want to clear some things up. I think, Mr. Kogan, you just shared with the committee an explanation of what constitutes a fiscal gap. And you said that the 1.7% fiscal gap of GDP, that the tax cuts from Bush and Trump exceed that. One of the things that I really want to clear up is whether or not we regard tax cuts as spending. We seem to not think that providing trillions of dollars of tax cuts to the wealthiest 1% of Americans, that somehow that is not spending. Can you help me understand why that distinction is made? Maybe I understand why it's made, but why that's not calculated as a part of spending?
Thank you, Congresswoman. In terms of how the NIPA tables might show it, they're going to classify for the reason that you want. But to the point of your question, it's a cost regardless of how you're classifying it. It is the deficit or the primary deficit. It's just the difference between how much you're taking in and how much you're putting out. And so one way to change that is to change how much you are putting in or taking out, and another way is how much you're taking in. And so these are true costs that are borne by the American taxpayer.
So when we reduce the tax bill down to 21%, that was a loss of revenue and it was spending. Am I correct?
I would say that the way that it shows up in spending is with the future interest payments. We have to bear the interest payments that then come from these tax cuts.
Okay. So you assert in your testimony that both revenues and spending are lower than earlier projections, meaning low revenues are responsible for persistent primary deficits. So we hear all the time that spending is going up, and we have many worthy things that we need to spend on, healthcare costs and, defense. So your statement really contradicts people's notion of what is causing these deficits. Can you explain that statement? So actually, we're not spending as much as we used to. Those projections are lower, but the revenues are lower. Can you explain that?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So spending is going up, but it's going up at a slower pace than we used to project it to be. And so I think people focus that this year was higher than the previous year, which, aside from blips, is that's roughly the trend is the upward trajectory. But the reason that I don't think that that's the right, that is basically driven by demographic changes and excess cost growth. And so mostly what's going on is it costs more to do the same. It's not like profligate spending, it's that it costs more to take care of our seniors than it did before, and that's okay, because we used to have a tax system that would keep pace with it. The problem is we now no longer have a tax system that would keep pace with it.
Just very quickly, I wrote down here D equals S minus R. Deficits equals spending minus revenues. Can you just sort of explain that for the record?
Yes, Congressman. So the annual deficit is the difference between how much we spend in total. You take all of our program spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, SNAP, and then also the interest. You take all of that spending, and then you look at how much we bring in federal tax revenue, and the difference between those is the deficit.
So when we talk about having high deficits, we're talking about having a lot lower revenue.
That's right, Congresswoman.
Okay, so with my remaining time, I just want to associate myself with the comments, particularly of Ms. Del Benny, with regard to the child tax credit and the investments that we make in children. Would you agree that should not just be regarded as spending, but should be regarded as investments? Just as similarly, Republicans like to associate tax cuts as investments.
I think we can all agree that putting money for children in the future is a wise investment. It's moral and good, and as I say, some of the benefits then redound to the federal taxpayer.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair. I would yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for handling this conference, and thank you all. I appreciate the expertise y'all bring. I'm just a dumb surgeon, so I'm just going to have to approach this in a little bit different regard. I think if you look at what our biggest challenge is in the future, really, it will be healthcare spending. And let me say why I feel that way. 1965, we began with the Great Society programs with Medicare. At that age, you thought life expectancy was 70. You were going to live 5 years. Now we pushed it to 80. 2 or 3% lived to 90. But there was never any type of calculation ever put in that system at that time to account for what would be growth in longevity. Nothing. And so now we're chasing the fact that we're adding 10,000 Americans a day to the Medicare rolls, but there was never any chase about that. And now the fact we're living to 80, not 70, there was never any planning done with that. And so we're hitting the cliff because of that. And as for what we're doing with child tax credits, also with the Great Society programs, we began rewarding, actually punishing the nuclear family. So if you look in the state of North Carolina now, 52% of the births in North Carolina are due to are in Medicaid. I see these patients, okay? I see them face to face, and I see the 16-year-old mothers, I see the 22-year-old mothers having children. They're Medicaid. And all of a sudden, these poor children, and they're poor children because they're being raised by children themselves, are now the government's problem. These are, again, problems that have been caused by policies put into effect with the Great Society programs. So now we have this huge, massive occurrence. Mr. Kogan, this is fact. We now have this massive occurrence, more and more people on Medicare because, hey, great, technological advances that have occurred that are allowing us to live longer, which are more expensive. So now we're paying more and more for people on health care, which is great, but we never thought of changing the formula as we're going along. And anybody now who wants to reform the formula, oh, we all want to cut Medicare, we want to do this, we don't want to do that. No, the numbers, just like you guys are pointing out with our deficit, the numbers just don't work. And so as we move along this curve, we have to do something with mandatory spending. And we talk about this great recovery during the Biden administration. The great recovery was because you absolutely extinguished America. And instead of 100 widgets a day, we were only allowed to produce 40 widgets a day. And the framework was put in during the Trump era for this great continued recovery to occur. I will agree with my Democratic colleagues. Everybody who should pay taxes should pay taxes. Period, point blank. I have no issue with that whatsoever. But our revenues are at record levels now, so it can't be just blamed on one side of this. This is a blend. This is an absolute blend. One question that I love to ask some of my social media, let's just say, favorite people are all espousing the modern monetary theory, that none of this really matters. We can just keep printing money and all the debt doesn't even matter at all. I just wondered if each of you could just spend two seconds really. Does debt matter? Is modern monetary theory actually a thing, or is it just a stupid pie-in-the-sky idea? How does that fit in relation to what's happening with our debt?
I don't think anybody here would endorse modern monetary theory.
I'm so glad to hear that. Debt does matter, correct?
Yes.
It does. It is critical. And modern monetary theory was a great thing with unicorns and rainbows and pie in the sky, and we could just keep printing money. It's not the case. It's not the case. Our national debt does matter, and it's actually truly a matter of national security. So, you know, what would I ask? I heard one person say one time, just because of this debt, what happened if we just devalued our currency? What would that look like?
You would lose world reserves currency status, and then we would have all of the national security problems that we discussed previously of not being able to monitor illicit financial activity, nor be able to use sanctions.
Right. It would just absolutely undermine our economy and our national stature, correct?
Yes, and in addition to the national security issues, you would raise borrowing rates for every household.
And you know what? This may be heresy, but a Republican said that. And I just put my head in my hands. So this is not a really, this committee usually is fairly bipartisan. Math doesn't take any politics with this. And so we see how critically important this issue is. Yes, we need to collect our revenues, but yes, we need to cut our spending. And yes, we actually need to stop paying people not to work. Thank you. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. Before I recognize Mr. Byer, will you explain to us how AI is going to help us stabilize spending?
I couldn't do that in my 5 minutes, but we're working.
Okay, but I know you're working on it.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for doing this. Dr. Murphy, I would suggest there are no dumb surgeons. And thank you for shouting out. MMT, I think Herb Stein said years ago, if something's too good to be true, it's not true. That's exactly where we are. And also, thank you for going through the increase in our social services over the years, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and how that has completely changed what we spend money on in the federal government. It's very different from when I was a child. The challenge is that it seems the American people love most of those things, which is why it's been so difficult to cut back on them. Even President Trump has said, don't you guys go touching Social Security, because he knows that this is, so then the question is, how do we pay for it? How do we begin to balance what the American public has come to expect from government? By the way, Mr. Chairman, I do completely share your concerns that our budget deficit at $33 trillion must be a very high priority. But we look at it, and thank you, Mr. Kogan, for all of your purpose. I think one of the things that's missing as we look at this budget and cutting spending in a lot of different ways is what's the fiscal effect of the disinvestment in our people? I mean, how much growth comes from the fact that we are putting money into our children, into education, into social services, and what happens when we slash that back?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So 5 things that I mentioned in my written testimony that I didn't have room for or in my spoken testimony. I wanted to highlight some of the cuts that were proposed by by this body in this chamber, right? So the idea was, oh, well, we need to reduce our spending, and that's the great way to help the future. And in going about trying to write the appropriations bills that would find those spending cuts, this chamber called for an 80% cut to Title I education grants, which helps poor public schools in every state. Called for a 59% cut to the federal program that helps make sure our drinking water is safe across the country. They called to cut our NIH cancer and stroke research. Across the board, these were kind of cuts to the future. And I would just say, as you were saying, these sorts of cuts are fundamentally short-sighted. You might lower a federal dollar here or there, but then you wouldn't have the redounding effects in the future that are critical to us kind of being competitive in the future.
Great. Thank you. Again, historically, I remember I used to prepare a little family's businesses taxes in the 70s and 80s, and the first $50,000 was a relatively low rate, and then it jumped up to 78%. So I think both our personal and our corporate tax rates were much more progressive in the 50s, 60s, 70s. How did that affect our GDP growth?
We had strong and robust GDP growth in the 50s and 60s.
Okay, yeah. Thanks very much. Dr. Falkander, is there any plausible method of closing the fiscal gap that doesn't involve generating new revenues?
Certainly, we could bring spending down significantly, and that would also close the fiscal gap.
Is there, let me put it back to, in the real world, is there any way, given the political realities of the American public and the American public's expectations, is there any way to do this without generating new revenue?
Yes, in the real world, we could bring spending down to the 21% that it has been historically of GDP.
But our revenues are at 16% right now. Doesn't
Our
it
revenues
leave us a gap of?
Last year's revenues were much lower. If you look at 2022's revenues, they were at 19.5% of GDP. So I don't think we want to cherry pick a single number.
Well, that is a cherry pick number, though, if you look back over the many years. And that's a number driven by all the investments we made, the money we doled out as part of the pandemic, the CARES Act, et cetera, which is why it surged in that 1 year. That's certainly not where it was in the years right after the TCJA. In any case, I have a couple seconds left, which I'd love to yield to my friend, Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say that I just basically resent our bringing up the old tropes about paying people not to work. We're not paying people not to work. I guess I'd like to ask you, Mr. Kogan, I mean, it wouldn't be fair to say that that our social services programs like Medicare, Medicaid are taking care of old people, disabled people, kids, most of the people who are on food stamps, work, and that it's an old welfare queen trope that these monies are going to people of bad character. Is that correct?
I completely agree with your assertion, Congresswoman. The idea that this money is immoral, is wrong, is poorly spent is really disgusting.
Thank you so much for that. And I yield back.
Ms.
I
Moore,
yield
Mr.
back to
Byer.
Mr. Byer.
And I yield back.
Thank you for yielding back. All right, now for the lightning round. How could I possibly forget Lloyd? So you don't want to take your time, so I can just go?
Mr. Chairman, you can do whatever you like.
Go ahead, Lloyd. And I apologize.
Well, I do appreciate, Mr. Chairman, the opportunity to participate in this hearing. I think this is a really important topic. I know this is a topic you've been interested in for a long time, but I think it's difficult for the American public or even members of Congress to understand the weight of what we're dealing with here. And I think particularly Mr. Smetters, what you've described, what could occur here, what will occur here, according to your testimony over the next 20 years if we don't change course, is really, it's a five-alarm fire. It's cataclysmic. History has plenty of examples of countries and empires that have risen, have maintained their dominance in the world for a long period of time, and then essentially have overextended themselves. And we I would say are potentially at the brink of that occurring here. And it could be a slow decline where rising interest rates are affecting the economic conditions, or it could be catastrophic, which I think, Mr. Smetters, you've alluded to. A sovereign debt crisis will occur when the capital markets, when investors no longer are willing to hold the U.S. dollar because they believe the government has the inability to pay or doesn't have the will to put ourselves on the right path to be able to pay. And Mr. Faulkner, you've talked about the softening. I don't know if I'm misstating what you're saying, but there's certainly a few weeks ago we saw a softening of purchases and the demand, which potentially is probably driving up interest rates now. But if that trend continues, whether it's individuals or institutions or foreign countries that are no longer willing to hold our debt, we're in real trouble, are we not? I mean, am I overstating the condition that we're in now? I see. Go ahead.
So debt crises historically are the worst of all crises. If you look back at COVID, look back at 2008, how did we deal with those crises? We issued more debt. We were able to use debt to cover those crises. But when the crisis is caused by debt itself, there's not much you can do at that point. And we've seen many societies completely reordered as a result of debt crises. Those societies cannot handle economic hits. Not to be dramatic about it, but think about the Nazi Party in 1928. They only got 2.6% of the vote. Then 1929 happens, a complete reordering of society in the face of large.
And we've seen the failure of nations as
totally.
Yeah, and it's why I appreciate Mr. Pascrell's earlier comments that I think we have to come together as members, regardless of party, and understand the situation that we're in. We have to accept responsibility. I think both parties, as Mr. Pascrell said, have led to the situation that we're in now. Mr. Kogan, I know that you've, in your testimony, you've been intent on blaming Republicans. Could you agree with me that both parties have brought us to where we are today?
My testimony was clear. It was a bipartisan extension of the Bush tax cuts was an instrumental part of it.
Yeah. Do you feel like both parties contributed to the situation that we're in today?
I mean, it was a bipartisan bill, so yeah, both parties were involved.
Besides the bill, would you say?
I think that. I mean, I think.
I'll stop there. And the reason I put you on the spot is because I think it's really important that we have to get beyond blaming one another for where we are. And it's why I support a debt commission, which I think is critical to us to change the trajectory going forward. We really need to come together and understand that this is far beyond blaming one another. It's far beyond politics. This is something we're talking about, the future of the country for future generations. And so it's critical that we act on this now. So I hope, Mr. Kogan, that we can get past just blaming a particular party. And that's why I appreciated Mr. Pascrell's comments. But one of the things I want to say as well, I don't think the American public really understands the situation that we're in now. And I've been looking, particularly if we do a debt commission, I think the role of a commission is going to be to help the public understand where we are, and knowing that we're going to have to make tough decisions and everything should be on the table. But in a very brief amount of time, I haven't seen a lot of work done out there in regards to past examples in history of what has happened and sort of looking at our current situation relative to that. And I'd be very interested in hearing from any of you on where we could go to help to explain to the American people what happens if we don't address this. Maybe Mr. Smetters, I'll start with you on that.
Sure. I mean, the impact on the economy, the American people, the wages, the borrowing rates are all going to be very negatively affected. And there's lots of examples in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, where this has happened. And there has been bipartisanship, certainly in the past. That's what 1986 was all about. You know, the joke before 1986 was one reason why these high rates didn't really matter is because paying your taxes was a civil obligation, just not a legal one before 1986. There's so many different ways to dodge those taxes. But in 1986, incredible bipartisanship most economists agree with that approach. And so I think there are examples that you can point to.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you,
Mr.
Lloyd.
Chairman.
Chairman Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your passion and concern about what I believe is the most significant threat to the United States, and one that, if left unaddressed, in probably nearer term than we think, will cause not only significant but irreparable harm that will impact interest across the political spectrum, by the way. For those who care about climate and want more climate spending programs, safety nets, entitlements, or for those of us who think that the job of the federal government is mainly to keep us safe and free, and most everything else is delegated to the states and the people, we still have to put a military on the battlefield such that protects our freedom and security interest. All of that is in jeopardy, as well as America's leadership in the world, if we slip into a sovereign debt crisis. So I want to focus on how things are being managed at this point with respect to Treasury bonds and the issuance of debt, and especially the rise in interest expensing, which some people think is the key measure of when we start to trip the wire and we start seeing a chilling effect, if not worse, in the Treasury bond market. I just talked to an economist literally before coming to this hearing who said 14% interest per revenue, Treasury revenue, tax revenue, is a tipping point where you start to see the effects in the Treasury bond market. And that hasn't been hit in over 30 years, but we are now over that. And then this gentleman mentioned the two significant, he said, the most significant events in his 27-year career as an economist and a policy advisor, which is the August and November Treasury Debt Issuance Advisory Committee saying, wait a minute, we're $250 billion short of the money we need to service the debt. That's significant. And we need a whopping $1.6 trillion in debt in the fourth quarter of this year and first quarter of next year. The bottom line is we're entering into this vicious cycle, and the interest and debt are going from unsustainable to completely running away from us. Now, the Treasury Advisory Group and the Treasury Department has started issuing shorter term debt rather than longer term, like 80% more. That hasn't happened in recent history, if not modern history. And that means the yield, if they call it an inverted yield, where we're spending, we're getting higher interest rates. And the trade-off is keeping the economy propped up versus the cost to the taxpayer, and I would suggest future taxpayers, and the cost to generations of Americans who will pay a higher price for our widening deficits and mounting debt. Help me understand that dynamic, the shift to short-term treasury issuance versus long-term with higher yields, lower cost. What are the implications of that? Maybe Dr. Smethers, you can start, but I welcome any input. And for the remainder of the 1 minute, I will yield to our witnesses.
Sure, and I'll try to be done brief. The cycle that you mentioned is exactly the right word. In particular, you could issue enough debt that interest rates become high enough that you actually now have to issue even more debt, and interest rates that go up even more. There's no market clearing that happens anymore. You can literally have an economic collapse that way. And what you mentioned about moving this shorter term, it looks in the short term like, hey, that's a win. We're taking advantage of lower rates. The problem is that you now take on more rollover risk, and that's not being costed and priced into the budget. And that's really a budget bias right now. We reward you for the lower expected interest rates. There's no pricing on their credit reform or anything like that for the rollover risk.
But the rates for the 10-year Treasury are now 5 1/4. Right. So we're actually paying more
even then
for the 10-year Treasury. Why the shift to this extreme shift to the shorter-term Treasury to issue debt. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
What the TBAC has told Treasury is that there's not sufficient buyers out there for the longer duration stuff. You can go ahead and find additional buyers for the shorter term stuff. To add to what you said earlier, one of the issues that economic literature has shown is once you get above 90% debt to GDP, so you were talking about debt service to revenue. Another one is aggregate debt to the size of your. Once you get above 90%, that's where fiscal crises, debt crises start to occur. We're above that. The belief in the literature is that we can go above that because we're the world's reserve currency, but there's no test out, nobody out there can model where it is. And so as Kent has said, 20 years from now at best, we get into that permanent spiral that you can't recover from. Now, in terms of the maturity mix, we currently have an inverted curve, so 1 years are higher than 10 years. We'd be cheaper issuing 10s in the short run. It's not, normally 10s are going to cost you more than 1. The reason is that most people think interest rates are going to come down. So it's okay to issue short if indeed interest rates do come down. We may actually end up with lower debt service costs. But those debt service costs will not be lower if rates don't come down because we don't get the budget under control.
Listen, I think the key, thank you for that. Not sufficient buyers of U.S. Treasury, treasuries. That is a very explosive statement when you're thinking about slipping into a sovereign debt crisis. Again, I think there's this false sense of security that as the world's currency, reserve currency, we will just forever be able to act like we're all modern monetary theorists and spend and borrow and print with no significant consequence. It doesn't sound like that's the case. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Jody. All right, and I saved myself partially because I want to spend a little time doing sort of technical, so I'm going to, let's start, because you've actually come close to this. Dr. Falkender, what does a failed bond auction look like? A failed bond, an undersubscribed bond auction. What does it end up ultimately look like?
Well, ultimately what happens is that the primary dealers who are part of the Treasury Borrow Advisory Committee have to step in and take on the portion that was not subscribed, and it ends up being at higher yields. And ultimately what could happen is that those participants choose not to be in future auctions. So because they're obligated to take on the portion that's not subscribed, they may very well withdraw from future auctions, and that creates additional problems in the future when we've got to issue more debt.
So what's the ultimate definition of undersubscribed? I mean, we had a 10-year recently that 24% was taken by the primary dealers, which, that's double what we would have seen traditionally.
Right, so I don't know that there's a formal, it's going to be a historical reference, that you're asking the primary dealers to come in and take a much larger portion than they are normally taking, and they may not themselves have set aside sufficient capital in order to fill all of that need.
That was actually what I was looking for, is at what point does the piping, let's call it the plumbing, our primary dealer network, not have enough cash on the books? If they had to take 50% of an issuance, is that more cash than they have? And at that point, have we hit a black swan where interest rates pop to bring in new capital? I'm trying to understand our fragility, to use a sort of pop culture economic term.
I don't know that I would say there's a specific number, because I don't want to ever give the impression that we can march right up to that number. Right, and so it does depend upon how much capital is available, what are the other things that they're funding, what does their reserve status look like, and that's going to change over time as to how much just excess capital the primary dealers have available in reserve to step in for these kinds of contingencies. That's not something that, for instance, there's N dollars necessarily set aside that I can give you a specific number such that you think that they can march up to just below that and be okay.
Right. Dr. Smithers, you've been bouncing your head up and down on this one.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's no magic number to take that example. Even at the current values right now, if all of a sudden the primary dealers really believe that Congress is either going to spend wildly or tax very little going forward, if they just lose confidence even at current values, things could unwind. And so it's really about their expectations of the future rather than a given auction. If they have, if they're confident in Congress going forward, they're able to raise the capital. If they're not confident in Congress going forward, the capital markets, they're not going to give them the capital.
Okay, I wasn't going to go this way, but could we spend 30 seconds? Did anyone have an expertise on, you're a broker-dealer, you've actually are in contract functionally with Treasury to be a market maker in the first takedown. How do you raise your own capital?
Well, that's really costly capital because that's equity capital that you would have to raise in order to meet your obligations. And so that could be cause great dilution of the primary dealer. It would not be the case that they could just go out and engage in leverage themselves, because this is a much more challenging market to do that. And that's why once they get spooked, that is going to be a serious problem.
You see, and that's something I don't believe members of Congress and even many who actually write about this area have ever understand is they have to actually raise the capital. Right. They often have certain relationships. I promised we weren't going to talk too much about repo, so we'll stay away from some of the swaps and the pledges. Do any of you see any potential stressors? I'm agnostic
against the market. It's that two-sided betting that's actually inefficient. Treasury could, over time, create more consistency in supply and really focus and eventually reduce risk premiums if they made the maturity structure much more predictable and really focusing on what they can actually provide that capital markets cannot, and that's long-term risk-free assets.
But hasn't one of the problems been on Treasury's long-term funding outlooks is some of the spending bills, discussions of tax extenders, where there's suddenly, like we had in fourth quarter and even first quarter of this fiscal year, we were way off.
Right. I mean, the projections were incredibly off. And this is the problem why I say the blame game is not that useful, because it doesn't tell us the best path forward. If we even think about the Bush era, remember there, Medicare Part D, the long-term effect of that was even bigger than the tax cuts there. I mean, it all comes down to your baseline and what you incorporate as your baseline. I don't think looking back is the way to go. I think it's really about our best decisions going forward. Whether it's invested in children or other things is independent of all that.
All right, and it's not heresy because the math is the math. CBO, OMB, even a couple of your groups, if you actually look at the numbers, basically say from today through the next 30 years, 100% of the future borrowing is basically demographics and interest. Okay, so we can spend, which broke my heart, and I've already shared with my friend here, our staff sometimes live in a partisan bubble that's what they know. This hearing wasn't about, because I have plenty of charts and show when you do the dynamic effects, some of the things you said drove me nuts, but that's the game we do here. What I want to know is, from today forward, what do we do policy-wise, or should we just stay the hell away from it? Stability, price efficiency, stability, and if you have suggestions there, and then my weird question, they get weirder. Have any of you ever seen Professor Schiller, 10 years ago, wrote an article about something he called a trill, which was almost selling an equity interest that actually would be sympathetic to receipts going up. You got a little more. Sympathetic, if receipts went down, you got a little bit less. And that way you had an instrument that was a sympathetic bond, where often what we have here is sometimes those bonds, are counter-cyclical. Should Congress dive into what do we do for stability, what do we do for liquidity, and should we also be looking at some alternative debt management instruments? Let's start at one end. What would you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say is that I think there are different debt management approaches that could be considered, and I think Treasury is looking at those. Some of my colleagues have presented encouraging to kind of look at longer term instruments, which I think has some value.
But when you say, sorry, and I know I'm interrupting, going back to Treasury Secretary Lou, because he and I had a wonderful argument years ago about wanting to sell super bonds.
Yeah.
And it was basically to get beyond a demographic bubble.
Yeah.
He fussed back to me that there wasn't an appetite, and I said, you hadn't really looked. When you talk about longer term bonds, are you talking 40s, 60s?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Yellen had at least expressed a desire to look at 50-year bonds and 100-year bonds. They do have the discretion to do that, as we talked about earlier. There was some feedback that there wasn't sufficient demand at that point. I do think that, it's going to be kind of a circular loop there, where if you're looking at longer-term, providing longer-term supply, there's also going to be a demand issue, and all of that's going to kind of feed back to what the market views as the long-term debt trajectory. So it really is going to go back to how do we bring down deficits and how do we stabilize debt? That would probably help in terms of stoking demand for some of those longer-term vehicles that might help in the way that my colleague suggested.
Okay, because there is a powerful argument that that type of bond actually has a certain credit enhancement because of U.S. demographics.
Right.
Sure.
You get beyond some of the cost structure, but
Sure.
that's...
Sure.
Doctor?
Yeah, yes, I agree with this. I mean, one of the problems that I have when people look at the current market and they talk about demand, that demand is all based on what they think Treasury is going to do in the future. They're trying to make forecasts. If Treasury created a much more predictable environment, then the private market could actually create this shorter term duration asset. So for example, in theory, economists would say, what textbook says, is that the government really just has to produce something similar to the asset you just talked about, in fact, called a console. It just is an infinitely lived bond that pays for interest rate forever. The UK has had some of these things.
Or perpetuals.
That's right, or perpetuals. And the private market, if they knew there was a constant supply of that, they can create all the intermediate durations. The repackaging is actually very, very simple without counterparty risk. That is something that easy custodial relationships can deal with. But the problem is that we sometimes people call the supply and demand side of the Treasury market competition. That's just wrong. We can actually have no equilibrium when Treasury is trying to optimize against the bond buyers, and bond buyers are trying to optimize against the Treasury. I think the goal is that the Treasury, at least over time, because there's current contracts that are written around what was issued in the last few years. Over time, Treasuries should get to a longer term maturity, ideally quite a bit longer, and let the private market be the one who dices up and creates some more intermediate securities. Right now, the budget scoring process, though, really favors much shorter term issuance because the rollover risk is simply not priced in.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Ms. Kogan, what would you do in that sort of, would you offer alternative instruments? What would you do?
I think, I agree with what has been said previous. That I think you can look into trying to do stuff in the margin. I know in the Clinton administration they did a little bit at the margin, but I think you run the risk if you kind of are messing with the bond market too much of having unintended consequences. I think the long run, the interest is a product of debt, and for the right thing to do is to look at the long run trajectory of our primary deficit.
Okay.
I was at Treasury when Secretary Mnuchin asked the TBAC to look at 50s. I was surprised that they came back and said that there wouldn't be sufficient demand for them, simply because as people are living longer, both pension plans and insurance companies, it seems to me, would have even more need for locking in interest rates over 50-year time periods, and yet TBAC did come back and say there wouldn't be sufficient demand for them. I do worry that if we can't even issue 10s and 7s as to whether or not there would be demand for 50s, particularly from our international potential purchasers. In terms of other structures, I like TIPS, if for no other reason, the Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, if for no other reason they get the right incentives. So interest costs to the U.S. government are lower in low inflation environments, higher than in higher inflation environments. One worries about whether the market would actually take the wrong signal if we start saying we're going to pay you more when the economy's doing well and pay you less when the economy's doing poorly. Is that going to be a signal that we think the economy's going to do badly? So I think there's some
But there's
perverse
argument-
signaling that maybe we're
but also
worried.
the alignment of incentives.
Yeah. So I like the idea of encouraging, and having the American people have, there are already plenty of instruments, though, where people can share in an improving economy. Generally the stock market more broadly. Usually Treasury securities have served as a hedge. I think what you're saying, and I'd have to give it more thought and go look at Professor Schiller's paper, as to whether or not there really is need for yet another security that already provides upside in good economies.
Okay, but how do you feel about the discussion in a perpetual?
Again, we would need to establish, I like longer term ones. There have been some corporate bonds issued with 100-year maturities on them.
Apple did 60s last year.
Yeah, so that was why I was a little surprised by the conclusion of the TBAC, because if AA and AAA companies can issue at 100 years, why can't Treasury find a sustainable market for 50s? I thought that market should have been there because, as I mentioned before, it seems like there's natural hedging demand from life insurance companies and pension plans.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you. I'm probably going to send you all a note asking for a little bit more of your thoughts, and I know you've been incredibly generous to do this. And part of the argument, in sort of my place here in Congress, is trying to make the argument that demographics is our destiny. Demographics is debt. Work through it. It's why, as we were here talking, we were talking about what could we do to disrupt the price of delivering health services, because Medicare is the primary unfunded liability in our society. And we are very uncomfortable talking about that, because most of what we talk about is financing of Medicare, not the actual cost of keeping someone healthy. But with that, I have a powerful interest on, are there some things we should do in our debt markets that show that we're going to try to reach beyond the demographic bubble? As I pointed out, I have a 17-month-old little boy we've adopted sitting in the back, and the math says when he's functionally just become an adult, U.S. tax rates almost have to double just to maintain baseline services. It's no longer, though, about the next generation. I will argue it's about all of our retirements now if these stressors continue, and I'm terrified of a black swan. So I want to communicate to markets that stability, liquidity, and that we're paying attention. So with that, I'm going to bring this hearing to a close. Oh, you wanted to give me the script. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. And with that, I really, really appreciate your time. And to Mr. Pasquale, thank you for letting me chat on your ear and try to be really annoying. And with that, the hearing is over.